Because I'm the chairman of this meeting. Everyone here should be aware that by law the meeting can be recorded by anyone attending, and in fact recording is being made. This means that the meeting can be filmed, and the film camera is running. Therefore, that doesn't apply, by the way, if any part of it is in private session, but I don't think that applies tonight. Anyone who does not wish to be recorded or filmed should behave accordingly. You know where the camera is, and please sort of get behind a column, get outside of the cameras. Please switch off mobile phones. The fire exits are the way you came in, and there's a fire exit over there, and the assembly point is at the rear of the large car park. They are the official announcements. So we will now start. Welcome everyone to the first of 2, or if necessary 3 meetings to discuss the Greenbelt sites that have been brought forward for development. This is a part of the local plan process which has been progressing for some time now. The objective assessment of housing requirement for the borough during the period 2011 to 2031 is 12,500 dwellings. Of these, it is anticipated that some 7,637 will need to be on Greenbelt sites. The purpose of these meetings is to consider the merits of the various sites, but no decisions or vote will be taken at these special meetings. They are for information gathering, and they are information imparting function. All councillors have been invited to attend and to speak, not solely the members of this panel, but it is not appropriate for the public to participate this evening. There will be opportunities later when the proposals go out for public participation early next year, and it is most important that people then participate in what will in due course be major decisions that are necessary but will not be universally popular. I believe everyone is aware this meeting will concentrate on the sites around Hatfield and Welwyn Garden City. The meeting on the 23rd of October, next Thursday, will handle the sites around the villages, although information on these sites is included in this evening's documents in the interest of completeness. If the work is not completed at the first 2 meetings, there is provision for a third on the 29th of October. Therefore, depending on progress and the time taken, it may be appropriate for us to adjourn this evening's meeting until the 29th of October. Now we move on to the printed and published agenda. Item 1 is substitution of members.
No substitution.
Item 2, apologies. No apologies. I have been asked to note the apologies of Councillor Sarah Johnson, who has wished to attend but was unable to make it tonight due to family reasons. Item 3, declarations of interest of members. Any members? Right. And item 4, public question time and petitions. Now we have some questions. If the questioner is here, I will call them, and otherwise I will read the question. The first question I have is, Will Davis? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, the Panzanger Airfield proposed site is deemed finely balanced in your current report. That view based on the numerous reports that feed into this process. However, some elements of those reports appear inaccurate to myself and others. Also, the criteria that judges it finely balanced does not seem to have been equally applied across all the proposed sites. I request that the sieving process is revisited to ensure that each location is judged on identical criteria with all the supporting evidence of that made plain to see.
I noticed that.
Sorry about that.
As the question doesn't state which elements of the report appear inaccurate, it is not possible to respond to this point. Whilst a wide range of issues are taken into account, no two sites are identical and the issues have been judged on a site-by-site basis to consider their suitability for development. Should you have any representations to make, these should be submitted during the consultation event in 2015. Thank you. One I have is Paul Matthews.
The planning inspector who signed off the current local plan in 2005 stated within his 2000 report that, amongst other things, the Panshanger ASR appears to be poorly located to any public transport facilities and the majority of town services and facilities, and has poor linkages to the town's main highway network. Also, the sites proposed by objectors as alternative ASRs at Welwyn Green and Cuffley appear to be more suitable and sustainable locations as safeguarded land for housing if they are needed. And in relation to suitable alternatives, such considerations should include the suitability and availability of more sustainable locations for development, such as sites put forward by objectors to this plan, as noted above. None of the above is either mentioned or covered adequately in your report. Can I please be advised what changes have taken place since the earlier report to change the Council's view? And if nothing has changed, then why is the Panshanger site currently being considered as a finely balanced option? For clarity, could individual responses please be provided for each of the above bullet points? Thank you.
WC4 Panshanger Aerodrome is an accessible site being close to local facilities. It is acknowledged in our report that contributions will be required from the development to mitigate its impact on the highway. Both of the sites considered by the inspector as alternative ASRs to which you refer also figure in our analysis this time around. Sites in the same part of Welwyn Green and Cuffley have been assessed as being more favourable and or finely balanced. The full answer to all of the points you have raised involves matters of technical detail. My office will write to you shortly with a full response on that basis.
Thank you.
Clive Bennett. Nigel Bennett. Sorry, I've got 2 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clive Bennett, and I'm speaking on behalf of the North Midlands District Greenbelt Society, which has approximately 1,300 active members. My question: in the local plan update dated the 15th of October 2014, under the sources of housing, parkland, oh thank you. Okay, good. I'll start again. My question: in the local plan update dated the 15th of October 2014, under the sources of housing land supply, table 1, completion and urban capacity by settlement, page 4, shows a total of 3,184, plus allowances of 1,002. This, in our opinion, would seem to be too low. Looking at the statistics from 2013 Annual Monitoring Report, table 20, stated that from 31st of April 2001 to April 2013, a net figure of 5,184 homes was completed in this period, which includes the recession. Therefore, the average for this time, if projected to 2031, shows a total of 8640 homes. With the government's new initiative of simplifying planning regulations, this should speed up the development of brownfield and backland development sites. Also, new legislation regarding the conversion of commercial buildings to flats should apply. Therefore, this must give an extra boost to the previous figures of 2001 to 2013. Thank you.
Right. The new local plan will run from 2011 to 2031 and not from 2001, so any completions prior to 2011 will not count towards the need for housing between 2011 and 2031. The Council has explored land availability in the urban areas, and our urban capacity is insufficient to meet the need for housing between 2011 and 31. A windfall allowance is made for sites that have not been promoted to the Council but may still come forward for development, and this includes an allowance for conversion of offices. And you did have a second question, which would be...
Oh, well, I was told that I couldn't use that.
Well, I will answer it. Your question was, could we explain what Rural South contains? Rural South area set out strategic housing market assessment, figure 2.3 on page 21, and contains the rural parts of the borough broadly, south of Welwyn Garden City, next to Brooklands Park, Cuthford, Little Heath and Welwyn.
Thank you. But with all due respect...
No, please.
Well, looking at the...
Please.
I didn't talk about the figure.
Please.
2001 to 2013 was the average.
Debate. You asked a question, I've answered the question.
Well, I didn't think we did, actually.
Please take it up with the officers.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Jane Quinton.
Good evening. The landscape sensitivity report has been produced in two phases, in 2012 and 2014, by unnamed authors in Welwyn Hatfield Borough Council. As already identified by the General Aviation Awareness Council in their submission to the 2012-2013 consultation, this is a specialist discipline which should have been conducted by specialists in the field, not least to ensure unconscious bias was not introduced. There are significant areas in which the landscape sensitivity report is inaccurate for WGC4 Panshanger, which, although notified to the Council, have not been updated since 2012. One of these points had already been queried by the planning inspector who signed off the current plan in 2005. It is important that this document is accurate, as it is a significant factor in the current WC4 site designation of finely balanced. If the sensitivity to change of the landscape is found to be low, this finely balanced designation should be changed to less favourable. Can this report be recommissioned, or at least moderated by an independent body to produce a consistent view?
Thank you. The landscape work was carried out by the Planning Department, working closely with the Council's Landscape and Ecology Manager and the Landscape Conservation Officer, who are both fully qualified specialists. The Council does not consider that this piece of technical work is subject to any bias. There are no plans to update the study. Should you wish to submit any representations which relate to the Council's evidence base, these should be submitted during the consultation period, which is scheduled to commence in January 2015. Right. Nigel Bennett.
Good evening, panel. I represent the land promoters at the Cuffley site, Cuff 5. I'd just like to ask the panel whether they're aware of the detailed technical feasibility work that Metropolis and the Council's own expert energy consultants have undertaken in respect of the Cuff 5 site to demonstrate that a zero carbon development solution can be achieved on that site, in addition to the extensive environmental impact assessment work that has been undertaken including a landscape visual impact assessment, which concludes that from key vantage points, the visual impact will not be harmful.
Thank you. The officers take into account technical work that's been submitted to the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment when considering the suitability of sites. It may of course be the case that the Council officers and or this committee will not agree with your evidence, or that the potential to achieve a zero carbon development is not considered to overcome the adverse impact that development may have on the landscape or the purposes of the Green Belt. Any representations you wish to make should be submitted during the consultation period and is scheduled to commence in January 2015. David Barber.
My question is about the Green Belt. Are there any plans to change the Green Belt as it stands today?
No, I cannot confirm that there is no plan to alter Greenbelt boundaries bordering the airfield site. In the Emerging Core Strategy, policy CS15 said the master plan will review the current Greenbelt boundary as if necessary to accommodate minor revisions where this would demonstrably improve the layout and sustainability of the proposed development. This remains the position at the current time. Thank you. Other questions were submitted, but they were after the deadline, and as we're a bit pushed for time, I think we should carry on. And they will be written responses from the officers. Now I think we can move on to item 5, the local plan update, which Colin, you're going to...
Thank you very much, councillors. I thought as part of this conversation it would be useful to update you on the purpose and roles and rules of the local plan and the local plan process. As a council, we are tasked by the government with preparing a local plan, and the duty of that document is to set out a vision for the future of the borough, looking at the social, economic, environmental aspects for the next 15 plus years. That document, once complete, should contain strategic policies, housing targets, employment targets, etc. It should contain site allocations, and it will also contain development management policies to help determine future planning applications. As part of that work, it will also decide where and when development should take place and where land will continue to be protected from development. The lack of a local plan, not being able to produce a local plan, creates the significant risk of planning by appeal, i.e. planning applications will come in, they will be determined by the planning committee, and they may well be appealed by applicants, and it will then be the planning inspectorate who makes those decisions. A local plan brings that decision making into our control as a council and as a community, with an agreed vision for where and when development will and won't take place. Without a local plan, there is far less scope to achieve high quality development and to secure planning contributions towards services that need improvement to accommodate development. What must a local plan do? The guidance states that we must seek to meet our objectively assessed needs for development, and that includes homes, jobs, infrastructure, services, and all the other activities that support a vibrant and sustainable community. We must demonstrate that we have cooperated with adjoining authorities and other bodies, and that includes the Highways Authority, the Environment Agency, etc. We've produced other reports that have been to this panel and will continue to come to this panel on the activities we're undertaking in that regard. The plan, in order to be found sound, has to be based on robust and credible evidence, and we have a number of evidence studies already on our website. We continue to produce and report evidence to this committee, and that will continue to happen during the preparation of the plan. It's also got to achieve sustainable development in terms of economic, environmental and social factors, and it must identify suitable, available and deliverable sites, so we can demonstrate there is the opportunity for those to come forward during the plan period. The objectively assessed need, as we have calculated it so far based on the evidence we have commissioned, is that we will need to deliver 12,500 dwellings in the period 2011 to 2031 in the borough area, of which we've calculated that 4,900 have already been built or are expected to come forward on brownfield land over the planned period. And there is also a need to provide for elderly persons bed spaces, of which a number have already been built. Our evidence advises that up to 12,000 jobs are likely to be created during this period, and as part of the local plan we will have to decide whether we want to protect all of our employment lands or whether we wish to allocate new employment sites, taking account of the fact that some employment land, such as offices, is being lost to housing through recent and potentially new permitted development rights, and we brought a paper to the panel last month on that issue, and we will continue to update on that knowledge. We also have to look at the transport infrastructure, utilities networks, drainage capacity, primary schooling, secondary schooling, healthcare, and all the other aspects of planning the community, as I mentioned earlier. The way we have sought to look at this, the start point we have taken based upon a decision by Cabinet earlier this year, is to look at a proportionate distribution of need around towns and villages in the borough based upon the housing stock as at 2011, and you will find a table in the report on page 4 that sets out what that proportionate distribution should be as a start point, and that will obviously depend upon the availability and the merits of sites that have been identified as part of the process. Now, the purpose of these meetings, as has been explained, is officers have provided a planning summary and a map of all the sites that have so far been promoted to us. Our summary is based on existing evidence, but I'd like to make it clear that new evidence continues to come in regularly, and we will keep updating you. And on that basis, it's worth advising, for example, that the WGC5, known to us as Birchall Garden Suburb, we have recently received new contamination evidence from the promoter of that site. That is being considered by the Environment Agency at present, and we will report their recommendations, their findings to you, and where necessary we will judge if that and other sites where we receive evidence alters the planning merits or dismerits of those sites. What we have done in the paperwork today is categorise, based upon the information we have at the moment, whether we consider sites to be more favourable, less favourable or finely balanced. And the purpose of bringing this to you tonight and on the 23rd and potentially the 29th is to seek your views on relevant planning issues that will help inform the consultation document that will then go out to the residents, to businesses, to all our other stakeholders and partners, so that we can obtain public views on those judgments to help us prepare the local plan. And as Councillor Nichols has highlighted, we will also be debating village sites next Thursday and potentially carrying on those debates onto the 29th of October if needed. What we have available to us is looking at the proportionate capacity for Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield. We have the brownfield capacity shown for Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield. We also have the amount that we need to find in the green belt. We have the potential capacity of promoted sites, and we've also given you information on which sites we consider to be more favourable and which sites we consider to be finely balanced. Just to let you know the further timetable, we will have these debates over the rest of this month. On the 23rd of November, we propose to bring to this panel further evidence, particularly transport, infrastructure and other evidence, and as we are able, we will publish that on our website, so it's publicly available. On the 11th of December, we hope to bring to the panel the draft plan to be considered for public consultation, and progressing from that, there is a special cabinet scheduled for the 17th of December to ratify that document. We will then formally publish it in the new year and look to organise public exhibitions and consultations and other events so the public are able to get involved. And then on that plan, we hope by the end of 2015 to have produced a final submission version of the plan that we will then seek the Council's agreement to submit to the Government, at which point it will be subject to a period of examination in public by an independent inspector appointed by the Government. Just to advise you of the next steps, the guidance is that we should assess or objectively assess need for development and then seek to meet it, taking account of other government guidance in the National Planning Policy Framework. Depending on the outcome of that debate, we may also need to reassess the capacity of suitable sites to see if we have, and if the developers have judged the right number that those sites could accommodate. We are likely to maintain a call for sites process to see if there are any other sites out there that have yet to be promoted to us. That should also be considered. We will continue duty to cooperate conversations with adjoining authorities as to the share of housing that might be distributed around Hertfordshire. And we may also have to look at the case as to how much development this borough can accommodate. But government guidance is clear that you should seek to meet your objectively assessed needs. Now, what we have available is maps of all the sites and a very short summary. Because the information has been published and is in front of you and can't be done justice in a very short summary, what I would propose is, as the conversation progresses, we can flick to the right slide to show the sites, but I will hand back to John to continue the debate.
Right, well, there's nothing anyone else wants to raise. We will go on to the sites now. Duncan has caught me earlier and asked for it, so if you'd like to start off, Duncan.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, at the last meeting in September, we discussed the objective of a proportionate distribution of development around the borough, and I'm glad to see Colin you raised that again today. That was one of the main themes that arose from the consultation exercise that happened over the winter of 2012-14. We also noted at the last meeting that Hatfield bore the lion's share of population growth between 2001 and 2011, the previous decade. Population growth was about 33%, far in excess of anywhere else. That's mainly accounted for by the growth on the former airfield site. Now, at first sight, the documents here, more than at first sight, to be fair, they do take us some way towards meeting that objective of a more proportionate distribution, largely because compared to 2 years ago, we have far more sites coming forward that are non-urban and outside of Hatfield, so that's good news. The problem is when I looked at the detail, and in particular the way the various sites have been classified as more favourable for development, less favourable, or finely balanced, because in between, we seem to have ended up with a massive overburden on North and West Hatfield, massively disproportionate. The two sites that have been identified in North and West Hatfield, Hat 1 and Hat 2, which are not only big but they're in close proximity to each other, unfortunately. Between them, they represent 75% of the potential homes that are being considered for a more favourable classification, 75% of the whole borough. That, I believe, undermines our achievement of an objective of some sort of proportional distribution. And therefore, I think the scale of which we've undermined it, unfortunately, means that despite all the hard work and all the good progress, I think at the moment we fail the service test. I think part of the problem we're facing is the sheer size and indeed proximity of those two sites. One of them for 2,000 homes potentially, one of them for 1,400. If we exclude those two sites and look at the analysis of all the other sites, on average the number of homes in each site comes to just under 150. These two, 2,000 and 1,400 respectively, are obviously of a different order of magnitude. And it worries me that because of that different order of magnitude, we have not applied the necessary increased burden of proof before kind of putting them both in more favourable, almost at a stroke of the pen. I think there is a risk. Maybe part of the answer, and I appreciate that we're up against a housing target, it's going to be difficult for everybody, but maybe part of the answer is rather than taking a site the size of those two and putting the whole thing in more favourable, is to actually break it up and say that maybe we can be more favourable up to a certain much smaller number of homes and the rest of it has to go into less favourable. I'm not suggesting you try and notionally geographically carve the thing up, but we just have to have analysis that says we can't just at a stroke of a pen put a site that size into more favourable because it has a massive disproportionate impact. If we were to go ahead, or allow HAP 1 and HAP 2 to go ahead, we have this huge mega development in one place, because they are very close to each other, which I don't believe will be sustainable. It would have no sense of community or place. And not only that, we would destroy the sense of community or place in the existing developments in Salisbury Village and Hatfield Garden Village. And that sense of community has been slowly building up over the last 12 years, and it would just destroy it and keep them back to square one again. Ironically too, although these are within Hatfield, they wouldn't actually help the regeneration of Hatfield Town Centre. You probably can't scale back. If you were to look at a map and a road map, it's obvious that anyone who ended up living in those two areas, if it was HAP 1, they'd probably drive to Welwyn Garden City for their shopping and whatnot. If it was HAP 2, they're more likely to drive to St Albans. And that would increase the unsustainability of the whole thing. That actually helping us get extra footfall in the town centre. I think the infrastructure at the moment is wholly inadequate to support those two sites. I know people will say, well, don't worry, there'll be an infrastructure plan and we'll build it all. But the problem with infrastructure, most of it, highways and education, schools, it's somewhat outside our limits, so we'd be at the beck and call of the county council. Water is the water companies and so on and so forth. Furthermore, anyone who knows the existing area will know that 12 years after most of the houses on the former airfield site have been built, most of the roads on those estates are still not adopted by the county council. That leads me to worry with that lack of urgency, and I've been chasing it, it's like pushing a piece of string. It leads me to worry that the infrastructure necessarily wouldn't actually take place. Now, I think in reality in the country today, infrastructure always lags behind housing development. That's something we all have to get used to. But given that, it is probably better to spread much of our development up into smaller parcels around the rest of the borough, rather than overwhelm one area and cause a very big problem. Now, I recall from 2 years ago when we had the core strategy that HAP 1 in particular, not only is it valuable green belt, but actually contains the majority of the most productive agricultural land in the borough. I think it's grade 1 or grade 2 or something like that. Food security is something that's raising its concern, and I'm reading about more and more. It seems to me that to sacrifice the most productive agricultural land in the borough, together with the fact that we've got a balance of payments deficit in this country, but if that's the way, if everybody around the country does that, that's a shortcut to hunger. I don't want to waste away and get food because of that. No immediate risk of that. We also, I think, there's a danger that if we overdevelop in Hatfield, and apply greater restraints to development elsewhere in the borough, we will increase the existing divide between the average house price in Hatfield and the average house price elsewhere in the borough. Now, I'm not being conservative, I don't believe in social engineering to try and make everybody's house price the same, but nor should we be following a strategy that actually reinforces that divide. So I won't waffle on for too long. In conclusion, I'd say we need to reaffirm and apply this commitment to a more proportionate development, which unfortunately seems to run by the board a bit. And the way to do that, I think, is first of all to look at the classification of these two mega sites into more favourable, to see whether perhaps we need to break that down a bit so we're not completely more favourable. I'm not saying they should be excluded altogether completely, but we need to break it down a bit. We need to look at some of the other sites that are outside Hatfield that have been put into the less favourable and finely balanced categories to see whether we shouldn't be biting the bullet and perhaps moving them up a bit. I appreciate that won't make it universally popular here, but if you look at the finely balanced and less favourable classifications outside Hatfield, that's a total of 4,700 potential homes, jiggling around a bit to make a big difference. And lastly, I think we need to look at the rejected sites. There are a number of rejected sites. No doubt the reasons for their rejection were valid at the time, although some of those reasons could equally be applied to these sites more than others. But I think since we're faced with the need to take difficult decisions, and this is going to be the lesser of multiple evils, it may be that bringing forward some of those rejected sites, or at least part of them, or some of them, would actually be a lesser evil than creating a mega unsustainable development in one place. That's really all I had to say. I think it'd be good if we could reinforce the proportionality to get back to a sense test, something that will pass the sense test. I do know that my comments are supported by my colleague Lynn Sparks, and also by Howard Morgan, other fellow board councillor. He can't be here tonight because he's chairing that with the town council. So I'll leave it at that, really. I didn't have anything else to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Carry on.
I've got an observation actually and a couple of questions. My observation is on page 39. It talks at the top of the page about healthcare facilities that are needed, but then a bit further down there's obviously a plan for 164 houses on the QE2 site. It just seems sadly ironic to me that hospitals are taken away but more people are put there. Also, it says on page 41 about expanding nearby primary schools in the Creswick proposed area, and then expanding the Springmead School in the Panzanga proposed area as well in 43. But both of those schools have already been expanded and are fit to bursting, and there's a severe lack of school places all over the borough really. So what we need is new schools, not more expansion, and I think some of the kids in some of those schools are learning from porta cabins, so if that's going to carry on, it's not a particularly good state of affairs. It does mention on page 45 obviously that there will be new schools in East Herts, but doesn't say where. I wonder if there could be some clarification at some point on where that would be. Pretty vague. And then on page 4, no, just another general observation really is the sites throughout the report which have infrastructure issues, existing infrastructure issues, seem to be the sites where most of the houses are being planned to be built, and the sites that have no issues have the least dwellings proposed to be built, which just doesn't seem to make sense to me. So I guess my question is, where are the schools in East Herts, and why is it that we can't look at the sites which have less infrastructure issues?
Thank you, Chairman. I think both speakers have touched on something that is really pertinent, and that is about infrastructure. And I do have another question for later, but how can we try and ensure that infrastructure will be put in place ahead or alongside housing, so that we don't end up in the situation we are currently where there isn't enough infrastructure to support the current housing?
Remember?
Do you want to use the mic?
Probably a good idea if we've got a big audience.
Thanks. My concern is that too much of this is about adding urban sprawl. The towns of Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield, I think, were designed to be a certain size, and some would argue that they're probably too large already. Every time you add housing on the edge of towns, you run the danger that the important links aren't there, that there isn't the bus, it's too far to walk. They're not close enough to local shops, and the sites that have been put forward, I think about 2 of them get, there's a concession that they might have one convenience store. Doesn't really look after all people's needs. Welwyn Garden City in particular was designed in a certain way, and I think it's got to the size that it ought to be. I don't think adding around the edge is helpful. I think the points about villages are somewhat different. Most of the villages are quite small, and it's perfectly feasible to add some housing that's still within easy walking distance of the facilities in those villages. So I don't think the same arguments apply there. And I also was tempted to feel that virtual garden suburb might at least be the gist of a good idea, in that it looked, I assumed it was going to be in effect a separate small settlement, a garden village, but having seen the plans that Lafarge have got at the moment, I'm not encouraged. What it actually shows is 2 separate areas of housing with a large green area in between. And we understand why it's a large green area, because that's the area that might possibly be contaminated. But it did look incredibly difficult to see how you would serve 2 separate areas, which are actually rather smaller than the impression that was given as to what the development might be. So I think there are some major concerns there as to whether that's providing something that's actually sustainable. And I'm pleased, obviously, that we're now looking at spreading the development round, whereas previously it looked as if the towns were taking almost all of it. And so it's a good thing that the villages we're looking at the villages taking some, and indeed, in many cases, some of the village shops might well become more sustainable with some more housing. We've read recently about threats of shops closing in some of the villages. But as I say, I'm concerned about this urban sprawl. If we'd started 5 or 6 years ago of saying to government, actually the way forward is to put at least some of our housing requirement into another new town or a garden city, and let's look at where the best place for it would be, we might well have made significant progress.
In fact, the two largest sites which Duncan has referred to, HAP 1 and HAP 2, both have to have the minerals extracted before the development can take place. So we are quite a number of years away from those being actually available for development to take place. And I think that time ought to be used more profitably by looking to see, can we join in the upswing that's taking place in the country of people saying, actually, going and having new settlements is the way forward. This is getting mentioned by more and more people on the national stage. And I think we should have joined that argument before, but we haven't. Maybe we should be joining it now. But I don't think adding forever to the edge of towns is the way forward.
Thank you. I tend to agree with Malcolm, and I mean, I've lived in Welwyn Garden City all my life. I've never taken the infrastructure or the green infrastructure for granted. I work in London, and I work for the borough that has the least open space than any other borough in London. And people there say to me, oh, you live in the countryside, you live in Hertfordshire, but you know, we shouldn't take it for granted. Open space is so important, and if we spread far out, how far out are we going to spread? We need to, you know, the inbuilt environment and the green infrastructure is so important. People's quality of life, you know, people enjoy having some open space, and if we put the pangs and the ergo, I mean, yes, I mean, if you're going to build on there, I think Astrid's right about the infrastructure there. The schools, look at the schools, they're already, you know, they're already full. We will need to build more schools. Where are the schools going to be built? Where the doctor surgeries? You know, the accident emergencies gone at the QT. There's more people. You know, thousands more people in Welwyn Hatfield. People are living longer, so we're going to need for healthcare. A small example. I live in Howlands, I represent Hollybush, I live in Howlands, and we've got a really good neighbourhood and community links. You know, they're sustainable areas. The neighbourhoods there are the communities in Hollybush and Howlands, also probably Pansang and Aldens. But if I look locally at my neighbourhood shops in Howlands, the pharmacy's closed, and there's a lot of elderly people live around there, and the pharmacy's gone. We're now looking at Douglas Tilbury House, which is a community centre for the elderly. Those facilities have been reduced. You know, we need to sustain and maintain those communities that we've already got. And if we're going to build all these new houses, because there is a demand for social housing, we will need to look at the infrastructure and the local neighbourhoods.
Roger?
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Chairman. Really, I just wanted to make a point about how we compare with our neighbouring local authorities, which I think perhaps puts us in context. Out of interest, St Albans are looking at 12,000 dwellings, North Hart's 12,000 plus possibly 2,000 to accommodate Luton expansion. East Harts Council, adjacent to the west, east, is 15,000, and we're at 12.5. So it's a very similar pattern for all the adjacent authorities. I think you know, the comment I've just heard that the neighbourhoods are suffering from shops closing. Obviously, with additional people, we should see, and we're looking for employment now. This isn't just about housing. We are also looking for employment. I think the figure of 12,000 extra jobs was talked about. Remember, this is a 20-year plan. This is, although we could go back 2 years. I'll just say, as the ward councillor for Pansang, obviously there's a lot of people here from Pansang, only fair to say. At the moment, the situation is that if you look at page 43, fourth paragraph, just read it out quickly. The owners of the airfield have been asked to consider providing a new runway, a line to the north of the existing one, which would allow for the provision of some housing development on part of the existing airfield site. And that's still a current proposition. So that's, I think the fact that it's a finely balanced scheme in this report is fair enough at the moment. sorry, I did also want to mention the Gypsy and Traveller site that's indicated. That site is part of the Home Community Agency ownership. The 700 houses is actually over 2 sites, 2 ownerships. They will have to come together as a master plan, and I'll be certainly voting against any Gypsy and Traveller site on that particular location.
I think that what has been said about effectively the towns being overexpanded is highlighted really with new towns where they were all planned to be certain sizes, and then they were expanded and everything came out of proportion in that the town centres weren't big enough and that everything just really became terribly complicated. Stephen, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. In some ways I share Duncan's concern on proportionality. But it has to be said that every city, town and village in this borough will be unhappy with the proportionality even as it's set out. Just as Hatfield and Welwyn Garden City feel that the numbers are too great for them, smaller villages, which obviously have smaller people, not smaller will feel the same about proportionality, and the numbers for them will seem horrific. But that's not really what I want to say. What I do want to say is, going back to what Malcolm said, and perhaps Colin can answer this, and I have had emails about we should say no housing, we should build new towns somewhere, not us, but it should be built somewhere. Can you, one way or another, Colin, tell us tonight, can we take any notice of that at all? You know, we can bang on to the government, we're not going to build here, we want you to build in Peterborough or in the Fens, or basically, are we stuck with this? Are you going to tell us that unless we do this, within a year, 18 months, the developers will be winning their appeals and building their 500 houses for a penalty?
We can make the point to the government as a council and potentially with adjoining councils that we think they should consider an alternative approach to delivering housing. But the current rules state that we have to produce a local plan, we have to maintain a 5-year supply of housing, and through the local plan we have to attempt to meet our objectively assessed need. Therefore, as things stand, if we can't do that, then there is a greater risk as time progresses that we will lose appeals and sites will be built on brownfield sites and in the green belt in places where we do not necessarily want to see that happen.
So we have to go through this process now?
Yes.
It'll happen anyway. Helen.
Thank you. Following on from that, can the officers please explain to everybody here how we have arrived at a figure of 12,500 dwellings compared to the 10,000 dwellings that we fought off previously? Why there is this variance that amounts to an extra 25% in truth? Thank you.
In summary, we brought a paper to this panel 2 months ago, I think in August, that explained our strategic housing market assessment. In summary, that is based on population projections, demographic trends, and various other sorts of evidence that our consultants, who we appointed through a tendering process because they demonstrated their qualifications and experience to do that piece of work, took into account to recommend a target of 12,500 over the planned period. The main reason for the increase from previous numbers is because across the country, particularly in the southeast of England, population projections continue to rise.
Aaron.
Microphone.
Microphone, right.
Thank you, and I think that's a really important point that was just made. We're told by some people this is localism and we can do whatever we want, and some residents would say, well, why aren't you building less? We want less. But the reality is you can't. This isn't localism as I would expect it to be. You have to have a minimum amount, and the government will decide what that is. This is a really important process, obviously, and there's lots of different emotions and views about this. And I think That's what's certain, is that we do need housing for people that already live here. And I think the way that this was introduced is we need to meet objectively assessed needs. One of the points I'd like to make, and I think it needs to be reflected somewhere in the consultation, and I'll explain why in a moment, is that a figure I recall from the last report that was brought to this panel was that we needed around 10,000 affordable homes in Welwyn Hatfield. Now, with all the best will in the world, if there are 12,500 or 12,000 homes built in Welwyn Hatfield, that's not going to deliver 10,000 affordable homes. So we're not going to meet that objectively assessed need at all, nowhere near. And the reason why that's important is people who are very much in favour, and there are people very much in favour of new houses being built in Welwyn Hatfield, are of that way sometimes because they feel that, and they're correct, that we need new affordable housing for people who can't afford the houses that we have now. But what needs to be made clear to them is that this won't necessarily provide that. And also there's an alternative view, which I don't have a huge amount of agreement with, that people don't want affordable housing in their areas. And what they need to understand is, again, by the same token, this isn't necessarily going to deliver much of that. As well as that, I think there's another view of, you should fill up the brownfield sites first. You should use these areas as, old warehouses and things like that. Well, when you look at Welwyn Garden City, one of the ethoses of Welwyn Garden City is that you can live and work in the same area. So if you're destroying that employment area, where are these people going to work? And what you're going to find is you'll need a brownfield preservation society, because it's going to start eating into the green belt. You won't have homes built in your green belt, you'll have warehouses built there, because people are going to need to work somewhere. And one last point I would make, and there's many points that can be made, and I'm sure they will be made inside and outside of this meeting, is we talk about coalescence. And to go back to Duncan's view on Hat 1, and I think anyone who flicks through these orange sites would immediately turn to this page, because it's the two biggest blobs. Is when you look at the northern part of Hat 1, what's that? That's Welwyn Garden City. And we talk about coalescence and the slow creep towards London. We talked about Hatfield on top of, obviously it all used to be Hatfield a long time ago, but Stanborough Lakes, to me that's Welwyn Garden City. So when we talk about coalescence, it would be happening there. And what people need to remember, of course, is this blob isn't going to appear of buildings overnight, nothing like it. The point was made that minerals need to be extracted. But that's what we're talking about, and I agree with much of what's been said already. Is that one thing that could solve a lot of these problems is a new garden city and some new towns across the south.
Well, as much as I appreciate part of the answer has already been given, that we have to go through this process. Have the senior officers of the planning department had conversations with other areas to determine whether there is an atmosphere of approaching the government and saying at a later date when this has gone through, when we've done this part of it, that we are not happy, they may not be happy, let's build a new town somewhere, further up, wherever it might be. Because at the moment it seems we're going down one track and we've not been told that until tonight. I didn't know there could possibly be an alternative, but if there is an alternative, are we also going to approach it in the correct way and try and now before it gets too late?
Well, I think it's probably for you, but I think the answer is yes, we're going down this route, but if there are very strong views here, and the chances are that the views that are expressed here are going to be much the same views that are going to be expressed around the county and probably around much of southern England. So I think there's going to be very strong resistance to this. What is your view?
There are certainly debates beginning to take place amongst local authorities in the whole of the area around London, particularly in response to the London Plan and its growth requirements and its infrastructure requirements. As a planning officer who is here to offer you advice, I would continue to advise that the responsibility of this council is to produce a local plan in accordance with national guidance, and we cannot disregard that to pursue an alternative regardless of the potential merits of that alternative, because there are risks and there are consequences of not attempting to produce a local plan for our borough.
Thank you. Helen?
think Malcolm touched on it before. I think what is very important though, as we're looking at the dangers of coalescence, big numbers of dwellings, but we need to remember that so many areas within our borough have their own historic character, and we need to look at preserving that historic character, whether it means green verges, whether it means areas such as Old Hatfield. We need to really look after our areas.
Can I just come back on what Carl said? He raised the interesting point about whether other areas might want to have some of their housing in a new settlement. I mean, we had this discussion a few meetings ago when we looked at Stevenage. I made the point that Stevenage's boundaries are so tight around the town, they cannot now, they have not recently accommodated their growth within the town. They've built this massive area in North Herts, whose name escapes me, and I wouldn't wish that area on anybody having been up there, but at the end of the day, they are going to have enormous difficulties, and I suspect that it might upset some people politically, but they might be somebody with whom we could find common cause. We know that they have a very bad relationship with North Herts in terms of housing. There's been constant friction between the two authorities. So I think Stevenage is in an even more constrained situation than we are. So I think there is certainly one potential ally, not very far away at all.
Just final point, really. We need 10,000 new dwellings in the next 20 years. Are we? 12. Are we going to say to people who want to live here, you can't live here, you've got to go north of Peterborough to a new town? People come here because they want to live here, and it may be a choice of Welwyn Hatfield, St Albans, Enfield, I don't know. But they want to live fairly around London. And one of the problems that the settlements and the towns, cities around London have is that the people don't want to live a long way out of London. And the population of London is increasing massively, as you all know. The population of Manchester is going down, the population of the North East is going down. Because people don't want to live a long way away. They don't want to live a long way out of London. And part of the national looking at housing development over the next 20 years is not only where will people live, but where they want to live. And part of looking at what we want to do is, do we want to go say to people who want to live in this borough, yes, we will provide some housing for you to live in the borough. Or are we going to say, no, get lost, go to Newcastle? Now that we may answer tonight or not at all. Colin may answer that another day. Just one other thing, on the affordable housing. I was quoted in the paper last week, which has been unusual for me. And there was a suggestion that I thought that developers should provide their percentage of affordable housing. And somebody wrote in and said that that's social engineering and the affordable housing should go where it's needed. Who will decide on that in the end? We will decide on the numbers for towns, city, villages. Who will decide where the affordable housing goes? Will it need to go as a proportion to the number of houses? Or will developers be able to say, okay, well, I'll pay you some money so that it can go elsewhere? And if they do that, do we have the capacity for it to go elsewhere?
We will be looking at our policies. We can investigate potential options, and they can be debated by this panel. The current policy is that we expect sites over a certain size to provide 30% affordable housing in all areas, wherever they may be based. But as part of the local plan, all of these policies have the scope to be debated, and if members feel a different policy approach is valid, then we would happily consider that. But generally the policy is to seek affordable housing on all sites.
Ben, please.
I think that's another really important point, and some would suggest that is social engineering, because as well as being a place that people choose to come and live, Welwyn Hatfield is like any other place that people were born and choose to remain, like myself. And if we don't provide affordable housing, where is it needed? It's needed everywhere. Housing is needed everywhere. People will be born, and some people won't be able to afford to live in certain areas when they grow up. And some people might not choose to want to live in certain homes, in certain areas where they grow up. I think it's absolutely important. I know many families whose children have to move into completely different towns because there's no affordable housing. And I think that's really highlighted in the villages to the south as well, in Hatfield. I'm not talking about concreting over huge areas and filling up with affordable housing. And also I think we need to recognise and lead if we can. And that's the whole point, if we can. A lot of this is out of the control of this or any other local authority. A lot of this should be led by the government to produce quality affordable housing that people want to live in and people don't mind living in.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of things on Welwyn City Forum. If this went ahead, we would then be dependent on East Herts putting in neighbourhood facilities. If they did not put it in, you've got a huge housing estate with no facilities whatsoever. The other point of that area is infrastructure. I've been going on about infrastructure in that area. You've got fairly small roads. If they, I don't know how they're going to expand it, but if they brought it through past Springmead School and then add on to Springmead School, sort of making it a three-form entry school. But at the moment, it's a two-form entry school, and the traffic around the school run is horrendous. You make it a three-form entry school, plus traffic coming out of a new estate like that, you're going to end up with absolute chaos. And the other last bit, move to the other bit of Holden's Ward. HAL 03, the Ratcliffe Taillift site, does that include Ratcliffe Taillift site, actually factory itself? And if it does, has anyone told the employees that they're about to lose their jobs?
The site in question, Councillor Larkins, does include the Ratcliffe Taillift site, and that site, my recollection is that actually came out of the employment area at the last local plan, so in the 2005 district plan, and that was because the owner of the site actually expressed an interest in that site going from being a factory to potentially being residential.
Thank you. I think Councillor Larkins has just touched on that really important point again, that so much of what we would be trying to deliver would be dependent upon other authorities, whether it's neighbouring authorities that are meant to have a duty to cooperate, or whether it's the county council. Because he mentioned Springmead School. I happen to know that Springmead School has asked to be a free-form entry school, and the county council have refused.
No, we've got representatives of Springmead School here.
Okay, that's not true.
That's not true.
We haven't got the room, we can't cope as it is.
And that's, yeah, but it would cause huge problems.
Well, the thing that has been touched on is the London situation, and although we hear from time to time about the big problem that London has in finding additional housing, we haven't heard any suggestions of any large-scale plan to deal with this. And I recall that on a previous occasion when it happened, there was something called the London Overspill Scheme, which involved the expansion of places like Basingstoke, Andover and Thetford, and it didn't do those towns any favours. Anyone else? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, just again, coming back to Councillor Bromwell and everybody else's point on infrastructure, I know we're not at that stage yet, but sooner or later we'll be looking at infrastructure plans. When we get there, to me a plan will mean something that says this is what's going to be delivered, this is when, and this, most importantly, is who's going to deliver it, otherwise they get fired. Now, when we get there, will we be able to hold to account the relevant officials? Because it's no good just talking amongst ourselves and anguishing over a wish list. We're going to have people from the county council, the highways agency, the water companies, goodness knows what. There, so have we thought of a mechanism whereby that we'll be able to hold them to account?
We're in multiple discussions with all of the bodies that we need to work with, highways, county council in terms of education, healthcare providers, other transport providers. We're having all of those conversations as we go through this process, and if we are able to identify the sites that we favour for development, we will work with the landowners, the developers, the agents, their consultants to identify what facilities could be provided as part of those developments, schools, GP services, etc. And we would also look at the implications of those developments and how they and others might contribute to the improvement of those facilities. Now, some conversations can happen at a local level, some conversations have to happen at a greater level, so impacts on the A1M, on the A414, for example, cannot solely be resolved by this council, and that's where the duty to cooperate requirement really comes into effect.
Thank you, Chairman. My concern with WGC4 is the infrastructure as well. There's not only Springmead School that's at capacity, you've also got a secondary school there that is at full capacity. So where is the other infrastructure going to come from?
If the sites that you see on that plan were both favoured, and I would point out that WGC5 called South East Welwyn Garden City in our paperwork, but being promoted as virtual garden suburb, includes development opportunities in East Hertfordshire, and that thick black line in the middle of the plan is the borough boundary between us and East Hertfordshire. So a larger scheme is being promoted, but obviously that's not something we can decide on, that's something we will have to work with East Hertfordshire on. If all of these sites were favoured, then master planning work could take place for all of them and consider the potential impacts and the potential solutions, particularly in terms of education, primary schooling and secondary schooling. If they were favoured as individual sites, then we would have to work with those developers and look at the capacity to provide certain services, or to look at Section 106 contributions to facilitate the improvement of services off that site. Now, what we may have to recommend as officers to this panel in time is that it is easier to deliver those services where you have large schemes that can fund them on their sites, as opposed to multiple smaller schemes that have to provide contributions and a third-party solution has to be found. And I would advise, we would be offering that advice as part of the deliberation process as this debate progresses as to what offers the best opportunity to deliver housing and ensure that the necessary services come forward as well.
Anyone else? Right, well, so I'll just wind up that the meeting surprisingly has concentrated very much on principles more than the detailed sites, although some of the sites have been discussed. And that means that the meeting has taken rather less time than it's expected, so there we were thinking of running on during the night, and it's run on an hour or so. So I think the views have been made very strongly. I think they're fully understood, they're properly recorded, and they will be taken forward to the next stage. So if there's no one else, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending, and next week is another meeting on the same sort of basis. Thank you.
Really?